Have you ever wondered why therapy sometimes asks us to revisit painful experiences from our past? Why would we go back to old wounds when all we really want is just to feel better? It's a fair question. After more than 20 years as a therapist and identity coach, I've come to believe that one of the biggest misunderstandings about therapy is that healing comes simply from talking about the past. Well, it doesn't. Healing comes from changing what was learned during the painful experience. In my model of the psyche, which I call the filial psyche, there are three important parts involved in this process: the inner child, the inner critic, and what I often call the inner nurturing parent or mama bear. To understand why therapy works, we first need to understand suffering. Not all suffering is harmful. Some suffering helps us grow. It teaches us resilience. It teaches courage. It teaches us that difficult emotions can be survived. But there's another type of suffering, a type of suffering that leaves us feeling less resilient rather than more resilient. This is the territory of trauma, childhood trauma. The difference is not always what happened. The difference is often what we learned from what happened. When a child is frightened, when a child is rejected, criticized, abandoned, bullied, ignored, or emotionally neglected, something important happens. The inner child experiences painful feelings: fear, sadness, shame, an inner loneliness, an emptiness. But at exactly the same time, the inner critic begins forming conclusions about what those feelings mean, especially if we are left alone with these negative feelings. As children, we have no capacity to reason our way or soothe ourselves through a negative emotional experience. We normally expect to be understood, to be nurtured and soothed through our pain. We create primitive conclusions or predictions and build schemas about what happened to us. Those conclusions become beliefs. Beliefs like, I'm not important, I'm not lovable, I'm alone, I don't matter, it's all my fault. If I need people, I'll be disappointed. Over time, with repeated experiences, these immature beliefs become so familiar, we just stop questioning them. They simply become our reality. The inner child continues carrying the emotional pain into adulthood. The inner critic continues reinforcing these primitive beliefs. Together, the inner critic, the inner child form what I describe as a codependent relationship inside the psyche. The child feels, the critic explains under the guise of protection. The child suffers, the critic creates meaning from that suffering. The problem is that the meaning is often wrong, uncorrected through unhelpful parenting. Yet because it was learned during emotionally significant moments, it feels absolutely true. This is why understanding our thoughts alone rarely changes them. Most negative thinking is not the cause of suffering. It is the symptom of a deeper primitive belief. And that belief was usually formed during a moment of emotional turmoil and pain. This is where therapy becomes transformative. The purpose of revisiting old pain is not simply to feel emotional. It is not about catharsis. It is not about endlessly analysing childhood. The purpose is to revisit the original learning and create a new learning experience. Think about a child who comes home upset from school. Perhaps they've been bullied. If a caring adult sits with them, listens, comforts them, helps them make sense of what happened and reminds them of their worth, what does that child learn? They learn, I'm not alone. My feelings matter. People can help. I can survive difficult emotions. The problem's not me. The suffering, however, is still real, but the learning becomes healthy. This is growthful suffering. Now imagine the opposite. The child comes home distressed, nobody notices. Or perhaps they are told, stop crying, toughen up, get over it. What do they learn then? Well, they learn I'm alone. My feelings don't matter. Nobody will help me. Something must be wrong with me. The suffering becomes harmful because of what was learned from it. Years later, the inner child still carries these negative feelings. The inner critic still carries the imprinted negative beliefs. And together, they continue recreating the same emotional reality. This is why people often tell me, I know logically that I'm okay, I just don't feel okay. Of course they don't, because the inner child doesn't speak the language of logic. The inner child speaks through feelings, sensations, emotions, and nervous system responses. The beliefs, however, live in the inner critic. The pain lives in the inner child. So how do we heal? We gently and carefully return to the original wound. But this time we do not return alone. This time we return in relationship with our therapist and with their resources. With awareness, with support, with an inner nurturing parent. This is where something extraordinary happens. The child begins to discover that sadness does not automatically mean abandonment. Fear does not automatically mean a danger. Need does not automatically mean rejection. The old prediction starts to weaken. The old belief begins to loosen its grip. The inner child experiences something new. And because the experience is new, the inner critic can no longer maintain its certainty. The belief begins to change. This is what neuroscience calls memory reconsolidation. The brain updates old learning when it encounters a different emotional reality. In simple terms, the child expects abandonment, but connection arrives instead. The child expects criticism, and compassion arrives instead. The child expects overwhelm, but support arrives instead. The child expects shame, and acceptance arrives instead. The nervous system becomes confused for a moment, but it is a healthy confusion, because for the first time, something completely different has happened, and that difference creates healing. In my work, this is where the inner nurturing parent becomes so important. The goal is not to eliminate the inner child. The goal is not to destroy the inner critic. The goal is to create a healthier relationship between them. A relationship where the child feels heard, where the critic becomes less harsh, and where a new nurturing parent learns to step forward and lead. The therapist models a new nurturing parent that says, I see your pain. You are not alone. It wasn't your fault. You matter. We can get through this together. When that happens repeatedly, something beautiful begins to emerge. The child feels safer. The critic softens, and the adult becomes stronger. And slowly we move from surviving to living. The client has built their own nurturing parent. This is why deep therapy can be so transformative, because we are not simply remembering the past. We are changing our relationship with the past. We are updating the beliefs that were born out of pain. We are helping the inner child discover that what once felt unbearable can now be carried safely. And perhaps most importantly, we are no longer leaving that younger part of ourselves alone. Because healing begins the moment the inner child realizes that someone has finally arrived to understand, nurture, and protect the inner child. And that someone is you. If you'd like help healing your deeper wounds, visit my website, book a free discovery call. Let's see what's possible.